In the year 922 AD, a Muslim envoy traveling through the lands of the Rus encountered a sight so horrifying it would be etched into his memory forever. Ahmad ibn Fadlan bore witness as Viking warriors staged a funeral unlike any other. A slave girl was forced into intimate rituals before being burned alive alongside her dead master. His eyewitness account reads like a nightmare committed to paper, except it was all true. What follows is drawn from genuine historical sources that expose how Vikings turned sexuality into a weapon of dominance, a ritual of death, and a symbol of power. These practices shaped the medieval world and helped define power structures that echo even today. The details were so grotesque that many scholars once dismissed them as slander or propaganda. But the evidence remains, woven into sagas, unearthed in graves, and preserved in foreign accounts. From public consummations performed before entire families, to sexual executions staged as entertainment, to rape deployed as a form of terror and control, Viking sexuality was inseparable from violence. In this world, intimacy was not private but political, a theater of power with life-or-death consequences. In Viking culture, your sexual role defined your honor, your rights, and even your survival. Two terms carried lethal weight, arger and rhaegar. These words branded a man as unmanly, sexually passive, or effeminate. To be called arger was such an unbearable insult that Viking law explicitly allowed you to kill the accuser without punishment. This created a hierarchy harsher than any medieval caste. The active partner, the penetrator, retained his honor and status. The passive partner, however, was stripped of masculinity, legal protection, and property. His reputation shattered, he ceased to exist as a full member of society. By Viking standards, losing dominance in the bedroom meant losing citizenship itself. Men accused of being submissive could be barred from testifying in court, inheriting land, or even wielding weapons. Whispers about one's performance could spark vendettas. Icelandic sagas recount feud after feud ignited by sexual insults. The saga of Burnt Njal tells of a bloodbath that began when one man called another unmanly. Egil's saga describes warriors traveling across entire regions to kill someone who had mocked their virility. Women, too, wielded these accusations as weapons. The sagas record wives publicly shaming their husbands, undermining their reputations, and even divorcing them by proclaiming them weak in bed. In Laxdæla saga, a woman destroyed her husband's honor and forced separation by accusing him of being too gentle during intimacy. These words carried more destructive power than swords. The result was a vicious cycle. Men lived under constant pressure to prove their dominance, which bred violence, which in turn demanded ever more brutal displays of masculinity. Sexuality in Viking society was not an expression of love but a battlefield, one where losing meant dishonor, exile, or death. Sexual violence in Viking society was more than brutality. It was a system of control. The constant threat of being branded sexually passive kept men obedient and reinforced the hierarchy that defined their world. For the Norse, sexual assault became an instrument of psychological warfare. They knew that shattering a man's spirit was far more effective than simply killing him. Sagas describe the clamhog, the shame stroke, a cut or stab to the buttocks symbolizing forced penetration. This wasn't random cruelty. It was deliberate humiliation, marking the victim as sexually conquered without the assailant even needing to perform the act. But symbolism wasn't always enough. Captured leaders and warriors were sometimes subjected to direct sexual assault, their bodies used to display the victor's dominance. The saga of the Volsungs tells of kings forced into public rape to demonstrate total defeat. To the Viking mind, forcing someone into the passive role wasn't just degradation, it was theft. Their belief held that the victim's masculine essence was stripped away and absorbed by the conqueror. The impact was devastating. A man violated in this way could rarely return home with his honor intact. His community often rejected him, and many victims took their own lives. Those who survived wandered as outcasts, living testaments to Viking dominance. Sexual enslavement was also institutionalized. The slave markets of Dublin and York overflowed with captives destined for intimate exploitation. Sagas describe how raiders divided slaves like livestock, with the most beautiful women kept for chiefs and earls. In the Orkneyinga saga, Earl Sigurd is said to have kept a harem of Irish women, treating them as disposable property. Viking law codified a chilling double standard. Free women enjoyed strong legal protections, while enslaved women had none. A free man could use a slave sexually without consequence, and killing a slave who resisted was treated as little more than property damage. Medieval Icelandic law was explicit. Raping a free woman could mean death, but raping a slave required only a fine. The scale was enormous. Archaeological studies in Dublin suggest as much as 30% of the population were slaves, many taken for sexual purposes. The Vikings created a thriving economy of human trafficking built on exploitation, and it worked as strategy. Entire communities, terrified by stories of Norse sexual brutality, surrendered without resistance to avoid such fates. In the Viking playbook, the threat of rape could conquer more effectively than a sword. Even their weddings were drenched in sexual theater. Privacy was not just rare, it was considered suspicious and could cost a family its dowry. By law, the bride's relatives had to witness the couple's first sexual act to validate the union. If no witnesses confirmed penetration, the marriage could be annulled and the bride's family could demand restitution. Imagine being forced to perform intimacy while your in-laws listened outside, prepared to take the matter to court. The ceremony itself overflowed with erotic symbolism. One ritual involved placing Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, on the bride's lap, a fertility blessing with unmistakably phallic meaning. The hammer was blessed by the priest and passed around for all to touch, turning the wedding into a communal fertility rite cloaked in religion. When the groom removed the bride's crown, it was a public announcement that he was about to claim her virginity. The couple was escorted to the bedchamber, where priests and relatives blessed. The sheets with fertility prayers that blurred the line between sacred and sexual. The consummation itself took place under the ears of waiting family members who strained to hear proof of completion. By morning, bloodied sheets were displayed as evidence of the bride's purity and the marriage's success. In Viking culture, even the most intimate act was staged as public performance. Sexuality not as love, but as spectacle, law, and power. These wedding sheets weren't just symbolic. They were often preserved as legal documents, ready to be produced in court if a marriage was challenged. In some cases, relatives didn't just wait outside the chamber. They stayed inside. The saga of Grettir the Strong recounts a wedding where the bride's own uncle remained in the room to confirm consummation with his own eyes. Imagine your Uncle Mike standing by to witness your first night with your wife. It sounds absurd, but for the Vikings the stakes were deadly serious. If the bride was not a virgin, her family could be prosecuted for fraud. If the groom failed to perform, the bride's kin could demand compensation as though receiving damaged goods. Icelandic law spelled out penalties for every conceivable failure on the wedding night, turning intimacy into a contractual performance. These rituals had nothing to do with affection. They were about property, inheritance, and power. Love had no place when dowries and dynasties hung in the balance. The Arab diplomat Ahmad ibn Fadlan captured these customs with chilling clarity. His descriptions of Viking funerals read like the darkest field notes in history. At first, many historians dismissed his accounts as exaggeration or slander, but archaeology has confirmed far too many of his details. When a Viking chieftain died, the funeral became a days-long ritual of violence and sex, designed to pour life energy into the afterlife. The process began with a brutal question. The tribe asked the chieftain's slave girls, "Which one of you will die with him?" One would step forward, believing she would join her master in Valhalla forever. Her final days were spent in what the Vikings considered sacred service. She was given alcohol, drugs, and passed between men, each encounter framed as an offering. The warriors told her, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him." They believed their essence was carried through her body and transferred to the dead. On the funeral day, the ritual intensified. Ibn Fadlan describes how 6 men entered a pavilion one after another, each taking their turn before laying her beside her lifeless master. The finale was a grim theater. An elderly woman, known as the Angel of Death, strangled the girl with a cord while another plunged a knife into her chest. Her body was then placed on the funeral ship with the chieftain, which was set ablaze as the tribe prayed for safe passage of their combined life force to the afterlife. Archaeology has borne this out. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway contained 2 women, one likely executed at the time of burial. Similar graves across Scandinavia reveal young female bodies interred alongside powerful men, often showing signs of violent death. To the Vikings, this was the highest honor. She became a vessel of divine power. From a modern perspective, it was one of the most systematic forms of ritualized sexual violence in history. This creates a paradox at the heart of Viking society. Freeborn Viking women enjoyed rights unheard of in much of Europe for centuries. They could own property, inherit land, run enterprises, and even divorce men for sexual inadequacy. If a husband was too gentle, too weak, or simply unskilled in bed, his wife could legally cast him aside and keep her wealth. At the same time, enslaved women lived lives of terror, subjected to exploitation that would horrify even the cruelest medieval torturers. The saga of the people of Laxardal tells of Un the Deep-Minded, a woman who commanded vast estates and arranged marriages for her male kin. Some women even rose as merchants, controlling trade routes and captaining their own ships. The sagas recount wives who divorced husbands for being too soft, too vain, or too poorly dressed. In Njal's saga, Halgerd abandoned her husband because his shirt exposed too much chest, branding him unmanly. Viking women enjoyed legal protection against unwanted advances. Laws prescribed exile or death for men who forced a kiss or intercourse without consent. For free women, consent mattered centuries before it did elsewhere in Europe. But there was a darker truth. These rights stopped at freedom's edge. Enslaved women had no such protections. The same laws that defended free women's autonomy declared that slaves were property, usable at will. The contrast was deliberate. By granting free women unprecedented power, Viking society sharpened the degradation of slavery. A free woman could reject advances. A slave woman could not. Archaeology and sagas also show Viking women as active participants in violence. At Birka, evidence suggests female warriors fought in battle, while stories describe women urging their men to commit sexual atrocities against enemies. They knew their privileges depended on the system that enslaved others. Yet not all daughters survived to claim these rights. Unwanted baby girls were often abandoned to the cold or beasts. The sagas mention such acts casually, revealing how expendable most women's lives truly were. Viking attitudes toward same-sex relations added another layer of complexity. Homosexual encounters were not condemned, as long as roles were observed. The active partner retained honor, while the passive one was disgraced. The sagas tell of warriors who bedded both women and men, treating partners as trophies of conquest. As long as they dominated, their exploits were admired. Even the gods weren't free from sexual scrutiny. Loki was mocked for shifting into female form and bearing children, including Odin's horse Sleipnir. Odin himself faced ridicule for practicing satyr, a sorcery linked to women. Men who dabbled in it were branded ergi, sexually deviant, yet also feared for their power. Viking culture lived in this paradox. The strongest men risked being seen as unmanly, their masculinity questioned even as their influence grew. The law codified these tensions with brutal clarity. There was no outright ban on same-sex behavior, but accusing a man of being passive was nearly a death sentence. False accusations of submission carried penalties as harsh as murder. Masculine dominance had to be preserved at all costs. Any slip, whether in clothing, demeanor, or bed, could destroy a man's standing. This obsession bled into Viking justice itself. Punishments weren't just about retribution. They were performances. Sexual offenders often met ironic fates. Rapists publicly violated before execution. adulterers castrated before cheering crowds. Festivals sometimes staged humiliations of captives as entertainment, with wagers placed on how long victims would endure sexual torture before death or madness. The saga of the Jomsvikings even describes tournaments where prisoners suffered escalating degradations until they broke. Archaeology supports these grim tales. Execution sites show corpses mutilated in ways suggesting ritualized sexual humiliation, not mere killing. Violence as spectacle was woven into Viking life, normalizing practices that allowed raiders to commit atrocities abroad without hesitation. For them, rape, torture, and public shame weren't crimes. They were sanctioned theater. The Vikings built a world where sex, violence, and power were welded together as tightly as iron to a blade. Their methods were not random barbarity, but deliberate strategies of control. These practices shaped medieval Europe's laws, inheritance systems, and notions of masculinity. Their legacy spread across oceans, encoded in DNA, institutions, and cultural expectations that echo into the modern world. So the question remains: which civilization's sexual customs would shock us next? Tell me in the comments whose dark history you'd like to uncover.